and welcome to the Salem Athenaeum. My name is Owen Matthew, and I'm president of the board. Usually on this day, the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., we would have joined 1,500 other souls at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Breakfast at the Convention Center. Today, however, its 21st edition was held virtually. We, like almost everything else in our lives, will be following suit this evening. Our institution is 200 years old, one of a handful of libraries that dates back to America's beginnings. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, I ask you to please physically come to visit as soon as we can open our doors again for browsing at events and to enjoy our collections, our books, our conversations, our concerts, lectures, writers groups, and other social activities that we host in our beautiful 1910 Federalist style library, to which everyone is invited. The once-in-a-century events of this past year may have altered how we do business, but thanks to the enthusiasm and support of our members and friends, the engagement of our board, and the hard work of our staff, despite our age, we've mustered the agility necessary to survive these times. Now, I don't want to give the impression that we just plucked out of the air the concept that an interesting way to celebrate MLK Day would be to discuss whaling captains who were men of color. That would be a false impression. But after my wife surprised me with a copy of Skip Finley's book, Whaling Captains of Color, we did want to have the talk. And the way schedules and stars aligned, luckily the talk fell on this evening. I do think, however, that Reverend King would be pleased, because who else was there that we know of who was more interested in people rising out of poverty? And certainly that's the case of the men we're going to talk about this evening. Our speaker this evening is Skip Finley, radio executive, entrepreneur, and author. Skip hails from Michigan, who spent summers on Martha's Vineyard with his family from early childhood. He came east to attend Northeastern University and then settled in the area after college, initially to work in local television. He was quickly recruited, however, by RKO Radio, and thus entered the world of radio broadcasting and sales, from which he would not emerge for 30 years. Along the way, he eventually was the manager or chief executive of some 44 radio stations in 18 markets around the country, 5 of them as owner. Skip served in leadership positions on a number of broadcasting industry boards as well, and won a number of awards for his accomplishments in the business. He meanwhile, however, never lost his fascination with Martha's Vineyard, and Oak Bluffs in particular, moving there full-time in 1998, 50 years after those first summer visits. 20 years into retirement now, Skip has failed miserably in embracing the sedentary lifestyle that most of us pensioners look forward to. Instead, he's been serving as director of sales and marketing for the Vineyard Gazette Media Group and has written for them the Martha's Vineyard Magazine, Island Wedding Magazine, the Provincetown Banner, the Intelligencer and MVM Quarterly, Sea History Magazine, and Cape Cod and the Islands Magazine. A healthy compilation of the 250 columns he wrote for the Vineyard Gazette between 2012 and 2017 were published last year by Arcadia Publishing under the title Historic Tales of Oak Bluffs. Given his energy and sense of curiosity, coupled with his proximity to where it all happened, I guess it's no surprise that eventually he would be led to his interest in the topic of his new book, Whaling Captains of Color. Mr. Finley, welcome.
Thank you very much. That was probably the best introduction I've ever gotten. And I don't know how to follow that act. So, thank you all for joining us this evening. Let me see if I can do it. For the first time, I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation of what I wanted to talk about tonight, which serves a couple of interests. One, it helps to focus someone who by definition is ADHD and also OCD. I wanted to share that with you because hang on with me as I get this show going. All right. I wound up writing this book because one day at a very old age, I decided I wanted to become a writer. The publisher of the Vineyard Gazette, Jane Seagrave, found me one day, heard that story at a dinner party that, my wife and I were at. And I wound up becoming the Oak Bluffs town columnist for the Vineyard Gazette, which I know you know not much about, but the Vineyard Gazette's been publishing the newspaper every Friday since 1846. It's been publishing the Oak Bluffs town columns since 1963. It was written by a lady named Dorothy West. who I hopefully you've heard of. She was one of the Harlem Renaissance writers. Well, along the way, a very important thing for Martha's Vineyard happened. The whale ship, the Charles W. Morgan, was completely restored to working condition, put back in under sail, sailed up to Martha's Vineyard in New Bedford, the Stellwagen Bank, Provincetown, and a few other places. It was astounding enough, and the ship was important enough to Martha's Vineyard that Martha's Vineyard magazine that our company owns decided to devote the entire May and June 2014 issue to the Charles W. Morgan. The significance of that is that the Morgan wasn't built on Martha's Vineyard, but 7 of its captains and most of its crew for its entire history of 30 some whale ships over some 90 years were Martha's Vineyard people. Coincidentally, Paul Schneider, the publisher, the editor of Martha's Vineyard magazine, said, "Hey, Skip, how'd you like to write a piece for us?" And the fellow named Captain William A. Martin, the black whaling captain. I heard none of that. All I heard was write for Martha's Vineyard magazine, and I was on it. By the way, as a professional broadcaster, I've got a background that heavily flavored by research and demographics and things. I can safely say I'm an expert, and many people would agree with that. So I went to school with this fellow named William A. Martin. And it didn't take me long. In fact, it was probably moments to ask myself, how in the 1870s, 1890s, when this man lived, did he get to be the captain of anything, much less the whaling ship? Well, one thing led to another. And again, the ADHD and the OCD took over. Before I knew what had occurred, I bought 140 some books on whaling, or another way of saying I bought all the whaling books, read them, took notes, jotted them down to find out more about this man. On your screen, this was a local friend of mine, Daryl Morris, is a fine artist. His specialty is carving into sperm whale teeth, or what we today, call scrimshaw. This is his view of what he thought that Captain William A. Martin from Edgartown looked like. And I thought it was fabulous. He's since done a portrait of him, and I bought one of the first ones. Well, the big question was, how did William A. Martin and other men of color become whaling captains? To your right there, you'll see, actually, I'm not sure what they call that. I call it, a cameo of a fellow named Paul Cuffey, who turned out he was the first known whaling captain of color. Altogether, I found about 50 of these folks. Paul Cuffey really stood out more so than most. His first voyage was in 1778. If you think about it, that was 2 years after the American Revolution. It was also the same year that Massachusetts had crafted an article in its Constitution.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Excuse me. We're here and we can't see your screen. The screen sharing isn't working.
Right. Your screen share.
Went away?
Yeah.
All right, how about, Carolyn, would you like to do that and I can turn mine off?
Sure.
Oh, that was so pretty. All right, mine's off.
Okay. Let's see.
Someone named Herb Mayer entered the whaling room and admit. I'll do that.
All right, let me close this.
Anyway, Paul. Oh, there we go.
Okay, now go ahead.
All right, slide. Next slide. We'll just do it like this. Brilliant. All right, that's the cover of Martha's Vineyard magazine. That's William A. Martin and the scrimshaw we spoke about a moment ago. Next is the question: how did how did these people become whaling captains? And tonight I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining that. The answer is surprisingly simple and amazingly complex. Slide. All right. In 1778, when this man was the captain of his own ship that he owned, by the way, the state of Massachusetts crafted an article in the Constitution that every male in the state could vote except Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes, and Captain Cuffey was all three. His dad was an Aiken man from Africa who was a slave who was manumitted or freed from slavery, who married a woman from Martha's Vineyard who was a Native American. Hence, Captain Cuffy was what he termed a mustee, a peculiar term of the interrelationships of marriages between Black people and Native Americans, as opposed to, the other one. Anyway, Nantucket outlawed slavery in 1773, Massachusetts in 1783. Again, this man was captain of his own ship in 1778. Slavery in America ended in 1865, and the entire business of whaling, as we know it, lasted from 1715 to about 1928. Slide, Carolyn. Each of 15,913 whaling trips was a separate business enterprise. Different crew, different owners, different management, the captain, and his officers. Was pursued by 2,700 ships, and their trips averaged 3 to 4 years. Their job was very simple. Find the whale, kill it, cut it up, melt it down to oil, fill the hull, and return. It became the second most dangerous occupation after mining, by the way, highlighted by boredom, inadequate clothing, desertion, disease, poor food and pay, odors from hell, bad management, barbaric medical care, mutiny, parsimonious owners, cramped quarters, vermin, frightening weather, and at times, whales that fought back. Carolyn. This 200-year business depicted in that drawing up there was so awful that most people only went once, except, of course, those who didn't have an alternative, which is everyone of color, even in the years after America had been freed in 1776, but most of its citizens had not. Slide. All right, when you get to, how bad was whaling, man, I could go into such detail. Here's a quote from an English author, Sam Johnson: "The ship's worse than a jail. There is in jail better air, better company, better convenience of every time." We got to remember, for over 60% of the period that whaling was a business, Black people were legally enslaved and people of color marginalized. All right, slide. Here's some images of some of those men. Amos Haskins, who's Native American Black; John T. Gonzalez, who was Cape Verdean; Absalom Boston, Black and Native American, just like Paul Cuffy; Belaine, who's Native American Black, and that's something we're not going to get into with some of these people. But people of color, after a while, included a whole lot of people we don't think about today. For example, I've been asked, well, why did you name the book, Black Whaling Captains? I said, well, the first one, Paul Cuffy, he decided to determine that he was Black. Absalom Boston, who was half Native American, decided he was Black. Joseph Belaine, the person we're just looking at, as it turns out, he decided, although his heritage was also Black, that he was Native American. Oliver and many of the rest of the men that you see here, John DeLoma, Joseph Silva, the Dominguez father and son, Valentine Rosa, Luis Lopes. These men were all Cape Verdean. They took over the industry towards the end, something we'll touch on later. Then there's, William Shorey out on the other coast in San Francisco, who was Black. Henry Gonzalez, who was a total scoundrel on one whaling trip. In fact, he dropped the people off at an expedition and left them there and stole the boat, returned and got caught. So not all these guys are good guys necessarily. And then, of course, Mr. Senna. But here's the faces of the people who man these ships. It's a pretty good representation, of the 50 folks. Let me go back again with that. If you think about it, in that time, around by the 1920s, the Civil War had ended and we were in Reconstruction. So up until the end of the Civil War, until 1865, there was no such thing as an African American. Firstly, you weren't an American. And then, of course, if you were African, that didn't count because most of us in those years, of course, were in slavery. And then how you account for the people who were West Indian, or perhaps from the South Islands, South Pacific Islands. So this went on, but to every one of these people of color, they were Black or persons of color to people who were not. Next slide. Now I'm hearing myself. Turn my speaker down. All right. Of the 2,500 captains, that pursued whaling, about 950 of them were replaced due to sickness, death, or some terrible accident. Now, it's not really clear who decided who was going to be the captain when something happened to one of these folks. But 1,200 miles from shore, no one cared who was able to get the ship home with its cargo. In those days, there were no occupations leading to wealth for men of color in the 18th and 19th centuries, as you can imagine. I really love this picture, which is called Set 2 between the steward and the cook. There is a man on the ship, we believe his name was John Scales, the third mate, on the Pearl in 1854, who did a series of these, colored drawings, hand-drawn things. Imagine 11 years before the Civil War, a Black man in a fight with a white man. And this picture obviously depicts the Black guy as winning. That's cool aboard a whale ship, but on land, there was no possible way that could occur. You couldn't look a white person in their face in those years. All righty. All right, so geographically, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later, whaling included 73 ports in a triangle, generally including Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Sag Harbor, and of course New Bedford, that in 1795 became the whaling capital of the world. They call themselves the City of Light, and they use the Latin expression lucem de fundo, we light the world. By the way, Salem's whaling experience lasted from 1818 to 1868, over those 50 years, and they were the 24th largest whaling center of the 73 ports that we were able to determine. Whaling did end in San Francisco, but the last ship did leave from New Bedford in 1928. They didn't catch anything. Slide. Here's some of these ports between 1784 and 1928. It'd probably be easier to read up. I'm not going to read all of them, but there's a point to this. Massachusetts, there were 41. There were 10 in Connecticut. There were 8 in Rhode Island. There were 8 in New York, and singletons in several of these other places. Only Edenton, North Carolina, and Wilmington, Delaware, were south of the Mason-Dixon. All right, and people don't really focus on that, but the reason for that is the two Fugitive Slave Acts of 1792 and 1850, were so onerous that if you were a Black person aboard a whale ship and you sailed into one of those southern ports, you could be taken as a slave on the word of someone who decided that you were going to be that. And the people around you were obligated, by law, to send you back to that person so you could become a slave. Next. Needless to say, whale ships didn't stop in those areas. In this kind of graphic of this map, if you look at this, these captains of color sailed from Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, at the town of Edgartown, New Bedford, and they're all of them from Sag Harbor, Provincetown, or San Francisco. I was unable to find Black whaling captains from any other port other than these northernmost East Coast ports. Now, after 1865, only 5 of these 31 people who identified as Black and Native American continued whaling. And here on the slide, the ones in red, by the way, identify as Black. The ones in blue identified as Native American. And there's a line there after John Silver, which is 1865. So then you see all the red names: William A. Martin, William Shorey, Collins A. Stevenson, were the only Black people who continued whaling. Now, you would ask yourself, if you made that much money and you had that much opportunity, someone says they can see the PowerPoint. Okay. The business was so bad that they left. I've been asked a lot in these presentations. Well, when you say, it was that bad, the things that you think about, because we were all supposed to have read Moby Dick. I know not many of you did. I did. I read for a lot. But while it was accurate in its portrayal, it didn't really tell you how bad things were. So in my reading and my studying about these people, here's a couple. Most of your life for 3.5 to 4 years was spent in an area the size of the back seat of your SUV. That's not a lot of space. Along the way, besides having that poor food and bad management and being flogged up until 1850 when it was outlawed, what happened was, in that small bunk that you had, you may be out in the middle of the summer south of the equator and 120 degrees. Imagine how hot it was below. So you're probably dressed in nothing. And there's this story, about one crew member who didn't mind being covered with roaches all night because the roaches ate the bed bugs that bit you. That was one story. Another story about how bad it was I read that, there was a communal bucket that people used to clean their clothes and the decks with urine. Whale oil is a very greasy substance. And of course, there's, alcohol, helps cut through that grease. I'm sorry, alcohol, where it cuts through grease. So urine was a good thing to use for cleaning. So that's an indication how bad this business was. And we could change that slide. So over the period, these 52 whaling captains of color had a consolidated career of 150 years, from 1778 Paul Cuffey to Gonzalez in 1928. They killed 1,817 whales that produced 164,000 barrels of oil on 271 discrete voyages that brought back in 2016 dollars, $74 million. Again, consider the time frame, 1778 at the American Revolution, well before the Civil War, to 1928, just post Reconstruction. Okay, these gentlemen combined were able to bring back $74 million. All right, their cut of that was probably somewhere between $7 and $9, million. Now that's okay. You can go to to that next slide. And we're just going to talk a little bit about this business. This is the book. The cover of the book, has a couple of things that one is the Naval Institute Press never lets their authors pick the title of the book or the cover. I was able to pick both. Of course, I gave them several examples to select from. The painting you see on the cover was done by a man named Clifford Ashley. The original painting actually hangs in the New Bedford Free Public Library, and I saw it one day and said, that's the picture that I want. So, of course, I went to school, found out about Clifford Ashley. As it turned out, Mr. Ashley is famous for writing the book about knots. He's the guy that depicts all the knots, the monkey and all those things that you see for years and years, in one book in one place. He also happened to have been a writer and obviously an artist. Harper's Magazine employed him to take a whale trip in, I think, 1906. The year doesn't matter, but it was, towards the end of the whaling period. So he went out on a whale trip with 32 people, probably close to half of the people who were there, on the ship, on that trip, were men of color. As it turned out, one of those people aboard that ship, and we believe he's the guy with the harpoon, right there in the front of the ship, named Amos Smalley, a Black Native American from here on Martha's Vineyard, who was the one to actually harpoon a white whale aboard the Platina, years before that. So just a pretty interesting juxtaposition, the guy who really killed a real white whale happened to be a man of color. That's probably him on the cover of that book in that very famous painting. And of course, Harper's Magazine did a 2-piece article on this whale trip, which is amazing. And I forget the dates. They're in my book, but I believe it was 1904, 1906 sometimes in them, but it was in one of their April and May issues, just that I had written that article from Martha's Vineyard Magazine. And you can buy that book at your local independent bookstore. I always got to put a pitch in. And of course, on Amazon, if you can do it at your local bookstore, that'd be great. You'll get it quicker. Amazon, though, if you have Prime, it'll be free shipping. Last slide. All right, and that's a thank you. By the way, there's more information on this, my other work, some of my other writing, everything on my website, skipfinley.com. Please feel free to peruse that. And by the way, what the folks at the Salem Athenaeum have been putting together, besides that beautiful building and that huge collection they have, they're not doing that, except through donations. And if you're of a mind, you can go to their website and make one as soon as this program is over. Now, with that, the formalized part of the presentation is over. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit. Perhaps I could answer some questions. And I know Owen has got a bunch. We've lost him. There he is. Your mic is off. There he is.
Carolyn,
I have to
Carolyn,
unmute.
do we have some questions?
I don't think there's any in the chat yet.
Okay. So
Yep.
people, please send some questions to the
I
chat,
can't
if you
see.
will.
Yep.
While we have this man in our midst. Skip, I want to ask you about
Hey.
the wreck of the Essex. And you and I have talked about that a little bit. I think that just fascinates me. And
I love that subject. I love that story. I'm excuse me, but batshit crazy about Nathaniel Philbrook, who's one of the best writers that I've certainly ever met, and was kind enough after I'd met him here at the Edgartown Yacht Club to do a blurb for my book. But first, now you remember, there's not going to be a test later, but Judith Lund, who's encapsulated all of the history of whaling trip by trip by trip, so far up to the 15,913 whaling trips. So we remember in Moby Dick when the whale came and finally caught up to Captain Ahab, after eating his leg off and then killed him. Well, the fact is, of all those 15,000 trips, 2,700 trips, 2,500 captains, only about a dozen or so were actually killed by a whale. Okay, not that a lot of people weren't killed by whales, but there are plenty of other interesting ways to die, than having a whale do it on your behalf. In addition to that, most of the time when you're killed by a whale, it was almost accidental. The whale ship Essex, however, that was a little bit different. No one knows why that huge 80-some, 90-some foot sperm whale attacked the Essex during a whale trip. The attack didn't last long. It was less than an hour from the time that the whale, hit his head, rammed that ship and sunk it. The 26, 28 folks, on that boat, were at that proverbial 1,200 miles out to sea. And, what are you going to do? Well, they got into their 3 lifeboats and they did as best they can to survive. Part of that survival involved cannibalism. Unusually in terms of history, because, I didn't know this, no one knew this, no one would have expected that. 7 of the crew people were black men. One of them, who I think was probably the luckiest, deserted. He didn't trust the captain. He didn't trust the ship. He thought it was going to be a bad luck ship. So he jumped off the ship and went AWOL, if you will, at a place called Atacames off the coast of Peru. The rest of the other 6 guys, I forget exactly, but I think it was 4 of the black men didn't make the cut. They died along the way and were eaten by their shipmates. There were some of the other crew members, were white. They were also eaten by their shipmates, or that was the custom of the sea, as it was called in those days, and no one knows how many others there were, but in order, very few captains were killed by whales. A lot of people died as a result of whaling. Very few whales actually attacked a ship. I have a list of them, and it's literally a handful, with these peculiar names, and many of the times it may have been accidental. But the physics are pretty simple. You've got a whale ship that at its probably best speed may be able to achieve, if it's unloaded, 8 or 9 miles an hour. All right, when it's loaded with whale oil, that same ship may be able to go 2 or 3 miles an hour. Well, a sperm whale can swim up to 25 miles an hour. So, you're moving at 2 miles an hour. Something hits you, going 25 miles an hour that happens to weigh 50, 60, 80 tons is not going to result in a good day, for the diminutively sized whale ship, which is something I should say. We spoke and said that, the average whale trip, was 3.5 or 4 years. And we have this notion that, whale ships are these huge vehicles. They're really not. To some groups of children, they said, well, how big is it? Because, they don't get feet in yards and things. I said, well, if you took 3 or 4 of your dad's car and you line them up together, that's about how long a whale ship is. And you put 4 of them side by side, that's about how wide a whale ship is. So you're going to put 28 to 32 people on board that ship for 3.5 or 4 years. That's not a lot of space to do anything. And besides which, a whale trip's incredibly boring. At its best, if you do the math backwards, 280 years of whaling, divide that by the guesstimate, my guesstimate, how many whales were killed. During the period of whaling, they probably killed 1 whale a month, per ship. That's not a lot. So what'd you do the rest of the time of that month? Well, you clean the ship with your urine and ate terrible food.
Well, that's a fascinating story, and I think you said in your book that this cannibalism happened on a number of ships. It wasn't just the Essex. I mean, that was the deal, right?
That was the deal.
We're stuck out there, yeah.
Yeah.
So if a whale man asked,
when it happened, when mutinies occurred, that was big news worldwide because they're so extraordinarily rare. That's the part that we forget. It's kind of like watching, your local television news when the weather comes on. It's going to rain, and it sounds like the end of the world by the time they're finished.
We have a lot of questions from the audience. I just wanted to let you know.
Let's go.
Yeah.
All right.
I will. Give me 1 second here.
Oh yeah, take your time. But I just wanted you to know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to organize them a little bit. Yeah.
And I'm sorry if I could see who was asking. I couldn't see the question, so I will wait to take your lead. I will say a lot of you are old though. The pictures, faces that I see. I can say that because we probably share an age.
You will never be as old as I am. I can tell you that much by several years. Did you find many other stories, Skip? One of the viewers asked about other trading ships, other kinds of marine enterprises that were captained by Black men, or was it purely the whalemen?
That's a great question. Let me say it like this. The Black experience in the merchant marine was decidedly onerous. Okay, well, when you got on that ship, you were gonna go do something with that ship, something commercially. You're gonna go pick up something and bring it back. You're gonna go trade something and bring it back. Those trips didn't last 3.5 to 4 years. So you didn't have to be friends with everybody aboard ship. You didn't require quite the level of discipline that a whale ship required. All right, on a whale ship, captain's omniscient. When the captain says jump, there's no questions. You're just kind of levitating because he'll flog you if you don't.
That's interesting.
In the military, it was every bit as bad. It wasn't quite as bad because fewer of us were selected to join.
Yeah.
Okay, but if you go back, I believe I forget the exact numbers. I did a search. I read one book, and it's called Black Submariners.
Yeah.
And none of them were captains. They were all cooks and stewards.
Right.
Okay, over the years,
Right.
we've had 1,481 years of aircraft carriers built by the United States, and not a single one has had a Black officer. Certainly not a captain.
Right. Certainly, the image we see of Black men in naval vessels and so forth is always as cooks and stewards, and I, as
Neatly dressed, well uniformed.
That's true or not? Sorry.
Well dressed, neatly uniformed.
But cooks and stewards. Do we know of whether any people of color working on these ships were actually enslaved at the time, or were they always free people, free men?
We do not, and I've been unable to find that. As an example, Frederick Douglass, who we've all heard of, was able to escape slavery thanks to a whaler who shared their seaman's protection papers with him to allow him to escape to the town of New Bedford, where he got a job as a caulker. And then, of course, he became the famous orator, after that. But if you were so fortunate to escape slavery via the Underground Railroad or however, probably you changed your name. Probably you didn't want to let people know you were a former slave, because up until 1850, you could be taken back into slavery.
Right.
So it is highly likely there were many people who had been freed slaves who became whaling captains. None of my captains happened to have been freed slaves. Several were the sons of slaves who had been freed.
Interesting.
And there are others. The man who invented the single improvement in all of whaling for its entire history, Temple's toggle. Lewis Temple was a black man who had been a slave. We don't know if he escaped. Don't know how he got to New Bedford, but his harpoon is the one that was used most widely in the whaling industry until after he developed in, I think it was 1844.
Great. One of our viewers is curious about salaries. White whaling captains in Nantucket certainly made quite a fortune in their adventures at sea, but he wonders about whether the same was for the male captains of color.
To my surprise and delight, everyone in whaling was paid pretty much the same thing, with an exception of the Cape Verdeans. They were late into the game and got paid less. But let me go back to the beginning of that. Folks don't realize that the whaling as a business model is really the model for what today is venture capital. Our private equity funds and our hedge funds. You have a group of investors who get together, and they put their money in the pot. They hire management, some of whom are incented by partial ownership. The management hire a crew. They put the boat together. That, by the way, cost between $40,000 and $60,000 in money, as we know it today, to launch a whale show for one of these 3.5, 4-year cruises. When you come back to land, the oil is sold at the prevailing prices, and the money is distributed first. The original investors, they get their money back, so they're even board. Whatever money is left was termed a lay. So each man aboard ship got a portion of the lay based upon the deal he made. Captains generally would get between 1/10 and 1/14 or 1/15, okay, of the value of a dollar that they would make. The lowest ones on the totem pole, the new people, the green hands, they may get only 1/160th of the net profit or the proceeds of the trip. And of course, the Cape Verdeans, when the industry was on the wane, and the Cape Verdeans were fleeing Cabo de Verde, as their country is called, because of droughts and folks were dying, they were paid, 1/200 if they were just an ordinary seaman, or a rookie, as we would call them. But to my surprise, the black captain made every bit as much as the white captains. And the word in the title of the book, meritocracy, it really was. Like I say, if the captain went down and the ship's in distress, they want the person with the most experience to take the helm and get them safely home so we can get paid. And quite often it was a black person.
So whoever could do the next man up,
Whoever
could do the job.
There were 900 captains replaced of the 2,500 captains who went out to do whaling. So there's 958 opportunities for meritocracy to take its course and give the best man the job.
Right. We have another question about how the owners or investors in the ships came to choose black captains, and were these captains really accepted by the crews completely?
Great question. Okay. First of all, it really starts on the island of Nantucket with the Quakers or the Friends. Okay. Folks haven't really spent a lot of time over the years, paying attention. But the Quakers also fled England for religious reasons. Okay. Just like the Puritans. Of course, when they got here, the Puritans, okay, would castigate, the Quakers. The Quakers never believed in slavery. They've always been abolitionists. Now don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that, I want you to marry my daughter. Okay, and you're not going to join our church. Paul Cuffey was the first one to become a regular member of the Quaker Church, and go to mass or whatever with them. But they were opposed to that. And by the way, the Quakers were also the ones who financed the whaling industry beginning on Nantucket. So what happened over the years, when the Europeans got to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and America, a lot of the Native Americans died as a result of the plagues that Europeans brought with them. From measles to the Black Plague. Once the Native Americans started dying off, Black people were able to take their place, and it was the Quakers who were putting them on these ships because, as they said, we don't want these people to be enslaved. We want them manning our ships.
So the Quakers, but here's what I don't understand. I've never really been clear on. The Quakers did this because they were the men of color that they hired were there and they were available. They could get the job done.
Correct.
They didn't hire them because they were Quakers and they wanted to sort of give the Black man a break or anything like that. They were businessmen.
This is business.
Yeah,
this is business. With a firm religious foundation, but it was business.
Sure. Great. So one of their viewers says, wasn't there a legend that the whale that attacked the Essex had lost a whale, either a mate or a baby, at an earlier point, and that the whale thought that was because of the ship that the Essex they attacked? Are you familiar with that?
I've heard 10 different things. There's no way to find out. There's no way to prove. One thing I always want to point out throughout all of this, the part that's often forgotten is the whales, which is a really great story, because out of all, the whales are the ones who had the happy ending. We stopped killing them. People don't realize. I mentioned it. One of my friends happened to have been a submariner, and I said, tell me about whales. He said, well, we call them biologicals. If they're not willing to call them fish, not willing to call them humans, but they do know they made for life. They do know they have a language. They probably have a religion. Their hearts beat maybe 8 or 10 times a minute compared to a sloth that beats 1,000 times a minute. And they have found carbon dated harpoons in whales from 220 years ago. So in theory, there are whales that are swimming around today that have been alive since the United States left Britain, since 1776. There may still be whales alive. We forget that. Today we've characterized whales, with iconographs, like the pink sperm whale in the Vineyard Vines logo. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. So now, there's the whale Raina. There's a skeleton of the whale Raina that hangs in the lobby of the New Bedford Whaling Museum.
Right.
And beneath her is a small whale, which is her baby. And when you look at their fins, their hands have 5 appendages, just like our hands. I mean, it's uncanny, to see that looking up, from above. Yeah. But there's so many characteristics that we have in common with whales. All right, why we kill them. Most of the whales that all right, here, the experts at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the Nantucket, Nantucket Historical Association will argue this point with me. And again, I'm a former deal guy, I'm a numbers guy. Give me a spreadsheet, I'm good to go. A lot of friends have said, we'd rather give Skip a spreadsheet than a gun, and if he's on our side. But I did the math, and I've computed that we killed probably 300,000 whales over this 300-year period that were worth about $10 billion. Now you can argue that, you can check my math, and that's my guesstimate, and it's a pretty good guess. At the end of the day, it's not that many whales. Okay, sperm whales, for example, the most prestigious, the best, the highest quality, the ones you made the most money from, they've never been endangered. All right, the largest whales, blue whales, they've got a problem. Right whales, they've got a problem. Why do they call them right whales? Because those are the right whales to hunt. When they didn't swim that fast. They didn't see you coming. They're easy to harpoon. When you killed them, they didn't sink. Okay, so this is how we got into whaling. more than half of the industry of whaling was complete before we knew anything about whales other than we can kill them.
You just weren't asking questions. We were just taking the kill. Fascinating. We have a question. If each whaling trip operated as independent business,
Yes.
who organized the business? For example, bought the boat, hired the captain, and what all was the captain responsible for besides just getting out and getting back?
That's a lot. There were groups of owners on Nantucket, on Martha's Vineyard, certainly in New Bedford, and they were in the business of whaling. The majority of them happened, to have been Quakers. These men all knew each other. So the time came and, you had investment, a part of, 5 whale ships. Okay. One of them made money. The other 4 lost money. At the moment when the 6th strip went out, you didn't have the money to invest. So this changed and changed and changed, over the years. I believe Samuel Osborne from here on Martha's Vineyard in Edgartown was one of the biggest owners of whale ships. Certainly William Roach, spelled R-O-T-C-H, was one of the largest investors, in whaling. And then after that, that's a question people don't ask was, what happened to all that money? Well, as the business ended in New Bedford, for a couple of reasons. First, in 1857, they discovered shale oil in Pennsylvania. So if we don't have to go out there and take a chance on our life, we can just dig in the ground and get oil. We're going to do that. The price of oil dropped. Okay. Once that occurred, then they started killing whales for their baleen, or what they called whale bone. By the way, it's neither. Whale bone is the stuff that hangs down from the top of a whale's mouth. It's roughly equivalent to keratin, or our fingernails, if you will, a human's fingernails, except they're, 14, 15 feet long and, a couple of feet wide. They use this product the same way they use spring steel or plastic today. So once you melted that down, once you heated it, it melts into a shape, it retained that shape. One of those shapes happened to be the corsets that dress designers used to make dresses throughout this period. And towards the end of the period, when the French decided that those tight 18-inch waist dresses were no longer in style, the whales were saved.
Tell me how, you mentioned that so many of the men only went out once, and that so many of the people on a given whale ship are fresh at it or very inexperienced. And I'm curious to know how did they develop the skills that they needed to survive? And I've always wondered if perhaps the fact there were so many people on these ships who really kind of didn't know what they were doing or were learning on the job, if that was one reason that so many ships were lost at sea. Is there anything to that?
Well, there is. It all started in the late 1600s when a whale would die, would roll up on shore and be called a drift whale. The Native Americans learned they could take this product and they could use it for food, and they could make things out of it, for their household. They could use the bone, they could use the flesh, they could, use all these things. After a while, they came up with the idea as well, we can see the whale out there. Why don't we go out there and row their canoes out, they would kill the thing and bring it back. Mm-hmm. Over the years, once we decided to industrialize that, if you will, well, let's send bigger ships out and get more whales and kill them and take them apart and butcher them and then bring just the products back. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much the business plan that did not require a lot of intellect. Mm-hmm. This was a business plan that saw no fundamental change from the late 1600s until the 1900s. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then, then it went crazy. Then the Norwegians got in and the Japanese got in. I don't even want to go in that direction and talk about that right now. It's not germane to this discussion. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But in this discussion, once you got on that, let me circle back to the 90%. The business was so bad that 90% of the people only went once. I believe there's about 175,000 people that ever went whaling over this entire whaling period. Okay, we've got the crew list, as they're called, at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and Library, and they're in spreadsheets now. They're about 125,000 lines long, each of which stands for a person, some of whom took trip after trip after trip. Well, the whaling person or captain, history would have us believe is exemplified by a statue in front of the New Bedford Whaling Museum of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy with a harpoon standing in the front of a whale ship. Those of us in whaling who know better, that'd be the last guy on the ship, in that position. Because when that young lover took his young lady friend out the night before his big trip, in Edgartown, he'd walk down the Bridge of Sighs, that was called, and the two of them would make love and make out, and he'd know the next day he'd be gone on his journey. He's going to come back a very rich man. Typically, that man got out maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes to buoy number 2 out there, and was sick as a dog for the next week, and he wanted to get off that ship. That's why they called these people green hands, because they threw up with so much they turned green.
Turned green.
Okay, and that young man had options. I can go back and work in my dad's store. I can work on the farm. I can get a job from my buddy's friend. There's a whole lot of things that I can do. Black, Native American, Cape Verdean, that wasn't true. You had to go trip after trip after trip after trip. So what you have, is an industry that requires almost no intellect and only repetition. All right. So your first whale trip of 3 years, you learned a lot about how to find, capture, kill, and butcher whales and get them back home safely. But it was these men of color who did it over and over and over and over and over again. So not just the 50 guys, that I write about in the book, but somewhere between 20 and 40% of everyone who ever went whaling was a person of color.
Wow, it's fascinating. And the point is, because they didn't have a lot of options, they went over and over again. They became skilled at it, and eventually rose to the top. You always have to remember that Black people, in order to find some sort of work, were willing to do jobs that nobody else wanted, and they did the very tough jobs. And here's another example of that, isn't it?
Well, and it's more, to get paid at all in these years is extraordinary. To get paid the same as the next guy, Black, white, or otherwise, that's just marvelous. To be treated like a man, to be treated the same way.
Sure.
That didn't happen for, if you think about it.
Sure.
From 1619, I think the New York Times says, 388,000 Black people were brought from Africa to here to become slaves. Right. Okay, the part that we often miss is that 3.9 million people who were released from slavery in 1865. So these folks were found, picked off trees, harvested like oranges, grown, fed, and ultimately, released. Yeah. So those are the options you face for the entire time. So do you want to pursue that life, or do you want to be out there at sea where, things are dangerous and times are tough? Times are a lot tougher if you're a slave than being free on a whale ship.
Yeah. Fascinating. One of our questions is, was there a camaraderie established between the captains and the men, and did they have bonds that, I guess, continued outside of the ship? I guess is what the guest is asking.
No, I'm certain some were nicer than others, but I have one. I tell the story of Joseph Benton, who's one of the captains of Cape Verdean.
Right.
And on the board ship, in his log, he actually says, "I don't talk to the men. My officers talk to the men." Rank has its privilege, and rank's paramount. Rank is paramount on the whale ship. When this small number of people, 30 folks, you don't have to be friends. You don't have to talk to each other, but you got to get along. You got to do what I tell you when I tell you to do it. All right, this man aboard ship. Let me tell you. Here's the story. A whale captain had so much power. When he left, he was given a wooden box with materials in it. Related. There were medicinal materials. Okay. So if something happened to you, it was the captain, whether he's got no degree in medicine, but he's the only thing you have. If you're bitten by a shark, he's going to amputate your leg. That's the reality, of life in those days. Yeah. And in this one story, when the crewman gets sick and the captain goes to the medicine box and he looks in there and it says, well, you need number 11. And he didn't have a number 11. They were gone. They were used up. So he took a number 5 and a number 6 and gave it to the guy. The guy lived, but the fact that this man with no education, with no training, with nothing other than he was good enough to have killed enough whales and get them home safely and make enough money that he could be the captain. And that's how you got your next job.
One of our folks asked, Skip, what was your interest in the subject? Are you a sailor?
Good, interesting question. As it turns out, I used to be a power boater till my wife found out how much that cost. And I was an offshore fisherman till my wife found out how much that cost. So I had a lot of experience, on the water. I grew up on an island my entire life, of course.
Yeah.
But no, that wasn't it. My this was nothing but naked curiosity.
Yeah.
This was, how in the world did this dude become a captain of a whale ship? You got to be kidding. And to
Right.
find that he wasn't the first and that there were more was astounding.
Yeah, right. We were lucky enough to visit the Charles W. Morgan just about a year ago this weekend.
Mm.
And first of all, I mean, I'm not tall by any means. I'm 5'9" maybe. I mean, I was walking around completely bent over, almost to about maybe 120 degrees or something like that. And up in the forecastle, I think the berths in the forecastle were stacked three high. It was an unbelievable. I couldn't imagine spending a weekend on that ship, much less 3 years or something like that. And it's fascinating. And I hope people that haven't been down to visit to go to visit. It's really something to.
Listen, I was on that ship on that voyage. I will never forget. I watched it come over the horizon on a beautiful, Chamber of Commerce blue sky day. Those huge sails, yards and yards and yards, these beautiful white billowing sails, getting closer and closer and closer. And of course, you're not thinking about, the perspective of size, even when you walk up to it, because it looks like a pretty big boat.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it turns out I may know people who own boats that size. Anyway, I too got on there. I was on the Morgan for maybe 15 minutes. I don't ever need to have my feet on a whale ship again as long as I'm alive, ever. Ever. And I've been 15 miles offshore Acapulco when I saw my one whale in a much, much, much smaller boat. That was a lot more fun than being on a whale ship.
Probably a little bit scarier though, anyway.
Oh,
We've had a lot of small whales, pilot whales around here. A lot of them. We kept running into them last summer. And I wondered, do you know about that? Was there a particular reason for that?
I don't. We know so little about whales. It's frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Even today, it's just simply bizarre.
So curious.
Other than now, we've learned to leave them alone,
Right.
which I think is wonderful.
Well, I have one last question. One of our viewers asked, hang on a second.
Didn't have to be the last one. I got some time if you guys are here.
Hang on a second. I got a couple actually. One of our viewers asked, can you recommend some of your favorite books on whales?
Absolutely. And there's different gradations of it as well. If you're interested in whales, you need to read Philip Hoare's book, The Whale. It is remarkable. Remarkable. He discusses, and he's a beautiful writer as well, but he discusses whales, in terms of the Bible. He says, the whale may have been the first critter in the Bible. I think it was the snake. A lot of people tell me it was a bird. I'm not a Bible reader, but it'd be worth a second look. Definitely read that about whales. If it's about whaling and you just want to get your feet wet, absolutely read Eric J. Dolan's Leviathan. Eric is an author of maybe 20 books. He likes to say that he's a writer. He's not a historian or any, but he's a very good writer. And it's a very detailed, very useful, and very interesting book. So I think those are the first two. By the way, Moby Dick's not on my list. Right after that, the whale ship Essex by Philbrick is just truly amazing because the story is outstanding, and the way he portrays it and the way he presents to you, you're right there on the boat with these guys, which is at times, not a whole hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I think those are my three favorites, and you can get really deep into this. Homer's book, I forgot the name of the top of my head. You can see my books over there. The bottom 4 shelves are my whaling books right over here. My wife's still angry about that, by the way. And it was I bought one. It was out of print. It was like $200 and some, and she just went crazy. What? It was on through Amazon or something. She says, what are you doing in there? And she hadn't seen me for a while because once I started doing this, it was I go to work and I come home and all I want to do was research this and write about it. Those are the best ones.
Great, thank you.
Go to you can go to my website and email, and I'll send you the whole bibliography.
All right. Someone asked what was the title of Filbert's book. I think it was In the Heart of the Sea.
In the Heart of the Sea, the Whale Ship Essex.
Yeah.
It was also the name of the movie.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The movie was.
The movie's pretty good. Book was better.
It was all right. Yeah. They touched on the cannibalism, but they didn't go into any big detail about it.
They did. Well, one of the funniest things. One of the one lady who died, who was at the Nantucket Historic Association Library. Yeah, I made friends with these people all over. I said, "Oh, did you see the movie? How'd you like?" She said, "Well, I don't know. They had them wearing these black outfits. In those days, the Quakers wore gray." Who would know that? I mean, that's what you got out of this whole movie. And then he said that the birds, those are not Nantucket birds. They were from someplace else. Busted.
I have one more question about the practice of slave owners lending their slaves, their property, to whaling captains to employ them on these trips.
That was the beginning of freedom on Nantucket.
Sorry?
That was literally the beginning of freedom on Nantucket. And I like to say in Massachusetts and the United States.
Yeah.
Prince Boston's great-grandfather was a slave who was hired out by his owner to go on a whaling trip. He did such a good job and performed so well that the captain of the ship said, "No, dude, I'm going to pay you. If I'm not going to pay your owner, I'm going to pay you, and let work it out." The owner died along the way. His son said, "No, we'll sue you. You're going to give us that money." William Roach, who owned the trip, said, "Not only will I sue you back, but John Adams is my lawyer." So as a result, Prince Boston was freed. Some years later, the rest of his family who were enslaved were freed as well. And that was really the impetus for the end of slavery. The Quakers, the Roaches, and whaling. Such a remarkable tie, to be able to date it right down to that moment in time is just wonderful.
It's fascinating. And Absalom Boston was his
great-grandson.
Fascinating. Well, Skip, this has really been enjoyable. We really want to thank you for giving us this gift tonight, and we hope you'll come back. You're quite a prolific writer. We didn't sort of get into the fact that you've put out 2 books in in less than a year.
I wrote a book while I was waiting for this book to be published.
Anyway, so it's fascinating. I'm sure there'll be more coming out from your pen as well. And
again, if you have more, feel free to email me. I'm pretty quick. I'll get right back with you. I'd like to thank you for giving up so much time on a holiday to do this. I don't know if I would have done it.
Well, you're here, so I guess you would have. Well, and I want to thank our viewers tonight, our guests. As I said at the beginning, I hope that when we get on the other side of this pandemic, that you come to visit us here at the Athenaeum. We have a lot of fun. One of our members called the Athenaeum just about the best treehouse for adults that they knew, and that's sort of the way I think of it. Also,
I can't wait to get
I want to
there.
let you know that on February 11th, there'll be a presentation. We're going to have a panel discussion actually on reckoning with racist monuments, and we have 3 people who are participating in that. One is a faculty person in art from the Pennsylvania College of Fine Arts. One is a history professor from the University of New Hampshire. And the third is a curator with the National Park Service in Salem and the Salem Maritime Project. And we'll be discussing, I think, a very timely subject today.